I'm going to introduce Christopher Rowe. Christopher Rowe has been a finalist for the Hugo, Nebula, World Fantasy, and Theodore Sturgeon Awards. Sorry about that. His work has been frequently reprinted, translated into half a dozen languages around the world, praised by the New York Times Book Review, and long listed in the Best American Short Stories. 10 of them are collected in Telling the Map. Please welcome Christopher Rowe.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, I've got a clock here too. I think I'm gonna read for about 15 minutes and then maybe take a question if there's a question. As is perhaps evident from the introduction of science fiction writer, I'm gonna read from the very beginning of the very first story in this book. I'm a science fiction writer, so expect robots and stuff like that. It's called The Contrary Gardener. Kaylin wandered up and down the aisles of the seed library dug out beneath the county extension office. Some of the rows were marked with glowing orange off-limits fungus, warning the unwary away from spores and thistles that required special equipment to handle, which Kaylin didn't have, and special permission to access, which she would never have if her father had anything to say about it, and he did. It was the last Friday before the first Saturday in May, the day before Derby Day, and so a week from planting day, and Kaylin had few ideas and less time for her victory garden planting. Last year, she had grown a half-dozen varieties of tomatoes, 3 for eating and 3 for blood transfusions, but she didn't like to repeat herself. Given that she tended to mumble when she talked, not liking to repeat herself made Kaylin a quiet gardener. She paused before a container of bright pink corn kernels, the pre-programmed color coming from insecticides and fertilizers and not from any varietal ancestry. Kaylin didn't like to grow corn. It grew so high that it cast her little cottage in shadow. If she planted it on the side of the house, it would see it grow at all. Besides, corn was cheap, and more than that, easy. Just about any gardener could grow corn, and a lot of them did. There were always root vegetables, a lot of utility to those certainly, and excellent trade goods for the Army supply clerks who would start combing the markets as soon as the earliest spring greens were in. Root work was complicated and meant having nothing to market through the whole long summer, which in turn meant not having to go to the markets for months yet, which was a good thing in Kaylin's view. She considered the efficacy of beets and potatoes and the various powers carrots held when they were imaginatively programmed and carefully grown. Root work had been a particular specialty of her run-off mother, and so would have the added benefit of warding her father away from the cottage, which he visited entirely too often for Kaylin's comfort. It would be hard work. That spoke for the idea, too. She strode over to the information kiosk and picked up the speaking tube that led to the desks of the agents upstairs. "I need someone to let me into the root cellars," she said. Blinking in the early morning light, Kaylin left the extension office and made her way to the bus stop, leaning forward under the weight of her burden sacks. The canvas strap that held them together was draped across her shoulders, and while she thought she had done an exacting job in measuring the root cuttings on each side so that the weight would be evenly distributed, she could already tell that there was a slight discrepancy, which was the worst kind of discrepancy, the very bane of Kaylin's existence, the tiny kind of problem that no one ever bothered to fix in the face of more important things. She could hear her father's voice. "Everything is not equally important. You never learn that." The extension office was on the south side, close enough to downtown to be on a regular bus route, but far enough to not fall under the shadows of the looming skyscrapers. Kaylin could now clearly see as she waited at the shelter. Slogans crawled all over the buildings, leaping from one granite face to another when they were too wordy, though of course to Kaylin's mind they were all too wordy. "The Union is strong," read one in red, white, and blue firework fonts. "The West Front is only as strong as the Home Front. Volunteer for community service." The only slogan that stayed constant was the green and brown limb sentence circling the tallest building of all. "Planting is in 8 days." A shadow fell across the street, and Kaylin looked up to see a hot air balloon tacking toward the fairgrounds. The Great Balloon Festival was the next morning in the hours before the Derby, and the balloonists had been arriving in numbers all week. It was part of the Derby Festival. The madness-tinged days that took over the city each spring, at the exact time when people should be at their most serious. The timing never failed to dismay Kaylin. The stars and stripes were displayed proudly on the balloon, and also a ring of green near the top that indicated that it was made from 100% non-recycled materials. It was wholly new, and so an act of patriotism. Kaylin would never earn such a ring as a gardener. Careful economy was expected of her and her cohort. The balloon passed on, skirting the poplar copse that stood behind the bus stop, and was quickly obscured by the trees. Kaylin's cottage was northwest of the fairgrounds, and the winds most of the balloons would float on blew above her home. She would probably see it again tomorrow, whether she wanted to or not. Belching its sulfur fumes, the bus arrived, and Kaylin climbed aboard. The bus driver was a Mr. Lever number 9, Kaylin's favorite model. They were programmed with 36 phrases of greeting, observations, generally about the weather, and small talk, in addition to whatever announcements were required for their particular route. And Mr. Lever number 9 never surprised you with what it said or did. That made Kaylin comfortable with public transportation. "Good morning, citizen," it said cheerily as Kaylin boarded. "Sunny and mild." Kaylin nodded politely to the driver and took the seat immediately behind it. The bus was sparsely occupied, with just a few tardy students bound for the university sharing the conveyance. To a one, their noses were buried in appallingly thick textbooks. "Next stop is Central Avenue," said the driver. "Central Avenue, home of the Downs, home of the Derby." The bus ground its brakes and came to a stop along the 3rd Street Road next to the famous Twin Spires. A crowd of shorts-wearing families hustled onto the bus, painfully obvious in their out-of-townedness, and clucking at one another loudly. "Infield," they said, and "first thing in the morning," and "odds-on favorite." Kaylin loved the Ville, but she was no fan of its most famous day. She appreciated horses for their manure, and for the way they conveyed policemen and drew the downtown trolleys, and she usually even bought a calendar of Central State views that showed the horse lord holdings with their limestone fences and endless green hills. But truth be told, she usually waited until February to buy the calendars when they were cheapest and when they were the only ones left. People in the Ville liked horses, but they didn't like the horse lords. "Grade Lane," said the bus driver. "Transfer to the fairgrounds, trolley." And then a whirring sound, and it added in a slightly different timbre, "See the balloons." All the tourists filed off happily chattering about the balloon festival the next day cart of racing at the Downs, and Kaylin breathed a happy sigh to see them go. The bus driver said, "They get to me too sometimes, but we're more alike than we are different." Kaylin turned around to see if anyone else in the bus had heard. Only the reading students remained, all in the rear seats, all still staring down. "Excuse me?" Kaylin said. She had never directly addressed a Mr. Lever of any model before. If there was a protocol, she didn't know. "Sunny and mild," said the bus driver. Kaylin considered whether to pursue the Mr. Lever number 9's unexpected, almost certainly unprogrammed comment. It had not turned its head to face her when it spoke, if it had spoken, and now Kaylin was beginning to allow that its not having spoken was at least within the realm of possibility. And usually the spherical heads would make daisy-wheel turns to face the passenger compartment whenever speaking to a passenger was required, or rather done. She supposed they were never strictly speaking required to speak. This was a thorny problem, and Kaylin reminded herself that she did not have authorization for thorns. She set her feet more firmly either side of her burden sacks, retrieved the pamphlet of helpful information that the agents had given her on programming root vegetables, and willfully ignored the bus driver for the rest of the trip. Kaylin loved her cottage and its all-around garden plot more than any other place in the world. It was her home and her livelihood and her sanctuary all in one. So when she saw that the front yard plots had been tilled while she was away on her morning errand, she was aghast, even though she was positive she knew who had invaded her property and given unasked-for aid in preparing the grounds. Her father was probably still poking around in the back, maybe still running his obnoxiously loud rototiller, maybe nosing through her potting shed for hand tools he didn't have with him on his obnoxiously loud truck, which, yes, now that she looked for it, was parked on the street 2 doors down, in front of the weedy lot where the sap house had been until it burned down. Kaylin did not miss the saps, though of course she was glad that none of their innumerable number had been harmed in the fire. Corn growers. Not like Kaylin, and to his credit at least, not like her father, who was a peas and beans man under contract to the Rangers at the fort 40 miles south, responsible for enormous standing orders of rounds for the sidearms that pushed him and his vassals to their limits every year. Her father did an extraordinary amount of work by anyone's standards, which meant, to Kaylin's way of thinking, that he had no business making even more work for himself by coming to turn over the winter-fallowed earth around her cottage, and that was just one of the reasons he shouldn't have been there. Yes, he was in the potting shed. "Don't you have an awl?" he asked her when she stood in the doorway, not even looking up from where he had his head and hands, completely in the dark recesses of a tool cabinet. "I would swear I gave you an awl." Kaylin hung her burden sacks over a dowel driven deep into the pine joist next to the door and waited. There was an old and unpleasant tradition she would insist to be seen to before she would deign to find the awl for him. He would just as soon skip the ritual greeting as her, but you never know who might be watching. He dug around for another moment before finally sighing and standing. Kaylin's father positively towered over her. He was by any measure an enormous man in all his directions, as well as in his appetites and opinions. This tradition, for example, he despised mightily. He leaned down, his shock of gray hair so unruly that his bangs brushed her forehead when he kissed her cheek. "My darling daughter," he said. Kaylin took his callous hands in her calloused own and executed an imperfect curtsy. "My loving father," she replied. Protocol satisfied, her father made to turn back to the cabinet, but Kaylin stopped him with a gesture. She opened a drawer and withdrew the tool he sought. "Wayward," he said. "That is a wayward tool." But he was talking to himself and sweeping out the door to fix whatever he had decided needed fixing. The imprecation against the awl was a more personal tradition than the state-mandated exchange of affections. It was his way of insisting that his not being able to find the tool had somehow been its fault, or possibly her fault, or at least anyone or anything's fault besides his own. Kaylin's father was always held blameless. It was in his contracts with the Army. Since he did not pause to sniff at her burden sacks, that conversation could be avoided for just now, for which Kaylin breathed a sigh of relief. She did not look forward to her father's inevitable harangue against root workers, and root eaters. She did not know whether his round, despite of all such things, antedated her mother's running off, as she had no memory of that occasion, or of that woman. But his rage, when he learned of the carrot seeds and potato cuttings hanging just by where he'd shouldered out the door, would tower. She trailed him out into the beds around the well house behind the cottage. He had lifted the roof up off the low cinder block structure and propped it at an angle like the hood of a truck being repaired. He was bent over, again with his head and hands in Kaylin's property. "Pump needs to be reamed out," he muttered over his shoulder. "You weren't getting good water pressure." Sometimes, when Kaylin thought of her father, she did not picture his face, but his great convex backside, since that was what she saw more often than his other features. He was forever bent over, forever digging or puttering, always with his back to her. Maybe that's why people say I mumble, she thought. I learned to speak from a man with his back turned. It was working this morning, Kaylin claimed, forcefully, if in ignorance, as she had not actually drawn well water before setting out for the extension office that day. And besides, now that she thought of it, they're hollering rain anyway. Her father snorted and kept at his work. He was family dismissive of weather hollers and any other mechanical construct that had a voice. He never took public transportation. "There's not a cloud in the sky," he said. "It'll be sunny and mild all day long, you mark me." His repeating of the Mr. Lever No. 9's phrase made Kaylin think back to the odd moment when the driver had seemed to break protocols in programming and comment on the out-of-towners. She wondered if she should ask her father about it. Part of his distrust of speaking machines was an encyclopedic knowledge of their foibles. If a talking machine failed in the Ville, her father knew about it, knew all the details, and wasn't afraid to exaggerate the consequences. He even harbored the conspiracist's opinion that such machines could do more than talk. They could think. Another conversation best avoided, she said. His father finished whatever he was doing to the well pump then and stood, careful to avoid hitting his head on the angled roof. With a grunt, he lowered the props that had held the tin and timber construction up, then carefully let the whole thing down to rest on the cinder blocks. "You were at the office this morning," he said, "making a withdrawal from the seed vaults. What's it going to be this year?" This was his way of not only demonstrating that he knew precisely where she'd been and precisely what she'd been up to, but that he knew very well the contents of her burden sacks, and his not saying anything so far had been a test, which she had failed like most of the tests he put her to. Kaylin's father was not an employee of the Extension Service, but when he said the office, it was the Extension office he meant, because it was the only indoor space he habituated besides the storage barn where he kept his equipment and his bed. All of the Extension agents were in awe of Kaylin's father, and she should have known one of them had put a bug in his ear as soon as she had requested access to the root cellars. Bureaucrats could always be counted on to toady up to master cultivators. Nothing for it now but to tell him. "Carrots," she said, pointing to the beds between the well house and the cottage. "They'll come up first." She leaned over and drew a quick diagram of her plots in the dirt at his feet. "Turnips." And she pointed, then pointed again in turn, and she said yams and potatoes, radishes and beets. Her father's lip curled in disgust. "The whole ugly array," he said. "You did this just to challenge me." Kaylin stood her ground. My ground, she thought. This is my ground. I did it because the market for roots is excellent, and I have never tried my hand at root work. His father snorted. And oh yes, you so very much like to try new things. Well, that's good to hear, because you're going to do something new in the morning. With that, he took a dried leaf from the front pocket of his overalls and unfolded it. Inside was a thin wafer of metal chased with a rainbow pattern of circuitry and magnetic stripes. Kaylin recognized it, of course. She had grown up in the Ville, after all. But she had never held one until now, when her father thrust it into her hands, because she had never, ever wanted one. It was a ticket to the Derby. Thank you.
I just finished reading that book,
Uh-huh.
and you have a very different view in this alternative Kentucky,
Mm-hmm.
Tennessee, and so forth. Do your personal views of artificial intelligence factor into that, or were you writing a story and that became part of it?
I don't know much about artificial intelligence as a real thing. There's a concept in science fiction called the singularity, which a lot of writers write about, which is this point at which technology becomes so sophisticated that we can't understand it and starts creating itself and all that kind of thing. I'm deeply suspicious of that, because those stories and those writers often write about what they call post-scarcity. And I don't believe in post-scarcity, because I believe that there is always going to be somebody that is doing the dishes in the background. I believe that there is always going to be somebody who is poor. I believe that there will always be, I think that privilege exists on top of lack of privilege, and so I reject and am dismayed by stories like that. So part of the reason I write the stories I write about the places I write is that I believe firmly that the future will happen everywhere. William Gibson famously said that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And I happen to know that there are cell phone towers and satellite dishes in Clay County. I happen to know that there are people who are perfectly aware of the current political, technological, and sociological aspects of the entire world who live in McKee. And so those people are just as important as people who live anywhere else in the world. They're not more important, they are just as important. And so stories about them that are exciting and colorful and take place in the future and have robots are, to me, something that should be told. And nobody was telling them, so I did that. How much is we about done?
So you read, that's about 2/3 of that story, right? Because there's a weird twist at the end of that story.
Yeah. I read 9 pages of a 22-page story. So, yeah, about half. Yeah. The rest of the story takes place at the Kentucky Derby mainly, which is kind of a wacky future Kentucky Derby.
It's quite wonderful that we have this complicated relationship between the daughter and the father. It's tense and stressful, and the father is the bad guy.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't know what's coming, except for this one tiny little instant with the bus driver.
Mm-hmm.
So that is so cool to put in that one tiny little moment, and which drives. I mean, that's a really important moment. That's the only sort of discouraging word, anti-technological word, and so I just give you a lot of credit for dropping that little, I don't know, perfervid nugget into the narrative.
Great vocab there, Roger. Perfervid. Thank you. I appreciate that.
I've heard you read this story,
Yeah.
every time. It stuck with me.
Thank you all for coming.